The phone buzzed at 12:04 a.m. I felt it before I heard it. A small vibration against the nightstand, barely enough to wake anyone. Mark didn't stir. He never did. 14 years of marriage teaches you the rhythm of a man's sleep the way you learn the creak of your own stairs. He slept on his side, one arm thrown over the extra pillow, breathing slow and even, like a man with nothing on his conscience. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling fan turning lazily above us, and told myself it was nothing. A work email, a group chat, some fantasy football notification he'd complain about in the morning and then check obsessively for the rest of the week. But something in me, some old, quiet instinct I'd spent years talking myself out of, made me reach for it anyway. The screen lit up my face in the dark. No lock code, because Mark had never believed in secrets. That's what he always said. "I've got nothing to hide, Claire." I'd believed him for 13 of our 14 years. The message was from a name saved simply as A. "Miss you already. Can't wait for Friday." I read it once. Then again, slower, the way you reread a sentence in a book that doesn't make sense the first time, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something less awful. They didn't. I didn't gasp. I didn't cry. I didn't shake him awake and demand an explanation, the way I might have imagined myself doing if you'd asked me a week earlier what I'd do if I ever found something like this. Instead, I felt something in my chest go very still, like a house going quiet right before a storm hits. That strange, heavy calm that isn't peace at all, but the moment right before everything changes. I set the phone back on the nightstand, screen down, exactly where it had been. I even angled it the same way, charging cable curling to the left, the way he always left it. Then I lay back down next to my husband of 14 years and stared at the ceiling until the sun came up. I want to tell you I spent those hours crying silently into my pillow. I didn't. I spent them thinking, running numbers, dates, the business trip to Denver in March, the guys' weekend in June that he came back from smelling like a cologne he didn't own, the gym membership he'd gotten in January and never once mentioned again. No gym bag, no protein shakes, nothing. Just a line item on the credit card statement I'd glanced past a dozen times without really seeing it. I am 51 years old. I have raised a son, buried both of my parents, run a small accounting business out of our converted garage for 11 years, and balanced a household budget through 2 recessions. I do not panic. I calculate. By 6 a.m., I had made a decision, and it wasn't the one Mark would have expected from me. I wasn't going to confront him. Not yet. I was going to find out everything first. Every date, every dollar, every lie. And then I was going to decide on my own terms, in my own time, exactly how this was going to end. He rolled over around 6:30, blinked at me in the gray morning light, and smiled the same easy smile he'd been giving me since we were 26 years old. "Morning," he said, voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I said and smiled back. It was, I realized, terrifyingly easy. I made him eggs that morning. Over easy, the way he liked them, with the toast cut on the diagonal because he'd once told me, half joking, half not, that food tasted better that way. I packed his lunch like I did most days: turkey on rye, the good mustard, a handful of the almonds he pretended to like more than he did, and an apple he would almost certainly not eat. I kissed him at the door. He smelled like the same drugstore aftershave he'd worn since college. And underneath it, faintly, something else. Something new. I used to think I was imagining things like that. I wasn't anymore. "Love you," he said, keys jingling in his hand. "Love you too," I said, and watched him back out of the driveway in the car we'd bought together 6 years ago, back when things were simpler, back before I knew there was an A saving messages on his phone at midnight. I want to take you back, for a moment, to who we were. Mark and I met at 26, at a mutual friend's barbecue in a backyard in Ohio. Both of us balancing paper plates of potato salad we didn't really want, making small talk because neither of us knew anyone else there. He made me laugh within the first 5 minutes, something about the host's terrible taste in music, and by the end of the night, we'd exchanged numbers on a napkin because neither of us had a working pen. We got married 2 years later in a church that smelled like candle wax and old hymnals, and for a long time, it was good. Genuinely good. We built a life the way you're supposed to. A starter home, then a bigger one, a dog that lived to be 14, a son, Danny, who inherited his father's easy laugh and my stubbornness in equal measure. Somewhere in the last few years, though, the good had gone quiet. Not bad, exactly, just quiet. Danny left for college, the house got emptier, Mark started working later. I told myself it was just a season, the kind every marriage goes through, and that we'd find our way back to each other eventually, the way we always had before. I didn't realize how far he'd already gone. That morning, after he left, I didn't cry, and I didn't call my sister, and I didn't do any of the things you might expect a betrayed wife to do. I sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop, a cup of coffee going cold beside me, and I opened our bank account. I am good with numbers. It is, without exaggeration, the thing I am best at in this world. For 11 years, small business owners in our town have trusted me to find the discrepancies in their books, the transactions that don't add up, the pattern hiding in a spreadsheet that looks, at first glance, like nothing at all. I started looking at our marriage the same way. The gym membership from January. A florist charge in February, flowers I never received. A hotel 40 minutes away in March, the same weekend as his conference. Recurring charges at a coffee shop across town, one we never went to together. Always around 10 in the morning on weekdays, when he was supposed to be at his desk. By 11 a.m., I had a folder. By that afternoon, I had a timeline. By that evening, when Mark came home and asked what was for dinner, I had already realized this had been going on, in one form or another, for close to 3 years. I made spaghetti. He told me about his day, a client meeting, a coworker's retirement party coming up. Nothing about Friday, nothing about Ashley, nothing at all. I asked him how work was going. He said fine. I asked if he was happy. He looked up from his plate, surprised, and said, "Of course. Why?" "No reason," I said. "Just checking in." He smiled at me the way he'd smiled at me for 25 years, and I smiled back, and underneath the table, my hands were perfectly still. That night, after he'd fallen asleep in front of the television the way he did most nights now, I sat alone in the dark living room and let myself remember, just for a moment, the man who used to leave notes in my lunch bag when we were newlyweds, too broke to afford real dates. Little things, folded twice. "You're going to have a good day. I already know it." I wondered when he'd stopped being that person, or whether he'd never really stopped, and I'd simply stopped being someone he thought was worth writing notes for. I didn't wallow in it. I've never had much patience for self-pity, even my own. But I let myself feel it once, fully, in the privacy of that dark room, so that in the morning I could close the door on it and get back to work. Grief, I've found, needs somewhere to go. Mine went into spreadsheets. Over the following days, I kept up the rhythm of an ordinary life with an almost surgical precision. I hosted my Thursday book club and discussed a novel I hadn't actually finished. I went to my sister's birthday dinner and laughed at my brother-in-law's terrible jokes. I answered client emails, reconciled a small business owner's tangled receipts, drove Danny's forgotten winter coat to the campus post office so it would reach him before the weather turned. Life, on its surface, looked exactly the way it always had. Underneath it, I was building a different kind of ledger. One Mark didn't know existed, and wouldn't until I decided he needed to. Over the next 2 weeks, I became someone I didn't fully recognize. Not colder, exactly, but sharper, more precise. I went through 3 years of statements, personal and joint, credit cards I hadn't looked at closely in ages because I trusted him, because trusting him had simply been part of the architecture of my life, the way you trust a floor to hold your weight without checking it every time you take a step. The floor, it turned out, had been rotting for a while. I found 41 hotel charges over 31 months, most of them at 2 chains, one downtown, one near the airport. I found recurring charges at a jewelry store I had never once set foot in, gifts I had never received, on dates that, when I cross-referenced them, lined up neatly with our own anniversary and Valentine's Day, as though he'd been buying 2 of everything and giving me only half. I found a second phone plan, a small charge easy to miss buried in a bundle from our carrier, activated 2.5 years ago. And I found the name again. Ashley. Not just in a saved contact this time, but on a hotel reservation, right there on the confirmation email he'd apparently forgotten was still logged into our shared cloud storage from a family trip years ago. A login he'd never bothered to remove, because why would he? I was never supposed to look. She worked with him. I found that out from a company directory I still had access to from a project I'd helped him with years ago, back when we still did that kind of thing together. Back when "we" was still a word that meant something uncomplicated. I didn't cry when I found her name attached to a face. I sat and looked at her LinkedIn photo for a long time, this woman 12 years younger than me, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not jealousy exactly, but a strange, clean fury, the kind that doesn't burn hot and burn out, but settles into your bones and stays there, patient, waiting. There was one more thing I found, almost by accident, tucked into an expense report I had no business seeing except that Mark had once, years ago, added me as a backup contact on his work email for a project neither of us remembered anymore. Some of those hotel charges, not all, but enough, hadn't come from our joint account. They'd come from his company card. I sat with that fact for a long time. An affair is a private wound, a private choice 2 adults make, however much it shatters the people around them. But this, using company money to fund hotel rooms with a coworker, this wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage. It was something his employer would care about very much. That was the moment the plan stopped being about grief and started being about architecture. I wasn't just going to find out the truth anymore. I was going to build something with it. I thought about Danny, 22 now, about to graduate, about how his father had missed his last 2 birthdays for work trips I now knew weren't work trips at all. I thought about the 11 years I'd spent building my own business from nothing, proving to myself I didn't need anyone to take care of me, and how close I'd come to forgetting that. I called a divorce attorney the following Monday, using a Google Voice number I set up specifically for the purpose, and made an appointment for later that week under my maiden name, just in case Mark happened to see anything on our shared calendar. I printed nothing at home. I kept the folder, digital and growing, on a flash drive in the bottom of an old purse I never used. The kind of hiding place a woman only needs when the person she's hiding something from is the person she sleeps next to every night. The attorney's name was Diane Reyes, a woman about my age with a corner office and a way of listening that made me feel, for the first time in weeks, like someone was fully on my side. I laid the folder out on her desk the way I'd laid out client books for 11 years, and she went through it page by page, nodding slowly, occasionally circling a date or a figure with her pen. "You've done half my job for me," she said at one point, looking up. "Most people come in here with feelings. You came in with evidence." "I've had a lot of practice not trusting feelings," I told her, and she laughed, not unkindly, and said she wished more of her clients understood that distinction before it cost them. We talked through the practical shape of things, the house, which I'd largely paid down myself through the leanest years of my business, the retirement accounts, the question of whether the company card discovery might affect Mark's earning capacity going forward, and therefore any support arrangement. Diane was careful, thorough, unhurried. She told me the paperwork could be ready within the week, but that the timing of when to file and when to have the harder conversation with Mark himself was entirely up to me. "There's no rush," she said, The truth doesn't expire. I left her office with a folder of my own now. Legal language layered over the financial one, two different kinds of evidence pointing toward the same conclusion. Driving home, I found myself strangely calm, the way you feel after finally receiving a diagnosis you'd suspected for months. Not happy, but no longer afraid of not knowing. 2 weeks after that midnight text, I had statements, dates, a name, a face, a company card violation, and a lawyer who believed me without needing convincing. I was ready to do something with it. Mark's boss was a man named Richard Powell, mid-50s, the kind of executive who'd been to our house exactly twice. Once for a holiday party years ago, once for a retirement send-off for a colleague who'd since moved to Florida. I remembered him as polite, a little stiff, fond of golf and terrible jokes about golf. I reached out to his assistant on a Tuesday, framing it the way you frame something you need someone important to say yes to without asking too many questions. I told her I was helping put together a surprise for Mark's upcoming 10-year work anniversary, a small gathering, some input from leadership, nothing that would take more than 20 minutes of Richard's time. She scheduled me in for coffee that Thursday morning, an hour Mark would be safely at his own desk across the building. No reason to think anything of it. I dressed carefully that morning. Not for Richard, for myself. A blazer I hadn't worn in a while, the kind of outfit that says, I am a serious person who is not to be underestimated. Which, as it turns out, is a message people receive most clearly from women who've spent years being underestimated in exactly the rooms they needed to be taken seriously in. I brought a folder. Physical this time. Printed, tabbed, organized the way I organize a client's books when I need someone to understand a problem in under 5 minutes, because executives, in my experience, do not have longer than that. Richard greeted me warmly, made a joke about how time flies, 10 years already, can you believe it? I let him finish. I ordered a coffee I had no intention of drinking, and then I opened the folder. I'm not here about an anniversary party, I said. I'm here because I think you should see this before I do anything else with it. I watched his face change as he flipped through the pages, the hotel charges, dated and highlighted, the ones tied specifically to his company card, the pattern spread across 2.5 years, laid out the same way I'd lay out a discrepancy for a client whose bookkeeper had been skimming. I didn't editorialize, I didn't need to. Numbers presented clearly tell their own story. This is... he started and stopped. He rubbed his jaw, looked up at me, then back down at the folder, as if hoping the numbers might resolve into something less damning if he looked at them long enough. I'm not asking you to do anything with our marriage, I said. That's between Mark and me, and frankly, it's already decided. But that's company money, Richard. Company money spent on hotel rooms with a direct report of his. And yes, before you ask, Ashley reports to him, not the other way around, which I believe your HR department has some very specific language about. I had done my homework. I always do. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked me, carefully, why I was telling him this instead of a lawyer. Oh, I've told a lawyer too, I said, and closed the folder. I just thought you'd want a head start. I stood, thanked him for the coffee I hadn't touched, and left him sitting there with a folder that was about to end a decade-long career trajectory Mark had spent his whole adult life building. I didn't feel guilty. I want to be honest about that, because I think we're taught, especially women of my generation, that we're supposed to feel guilty even when we're the ones who were wronged. That grace requires us to protect the very people who never extended us the same courtesy. I didn't feel guilty. I felt for the first time in weeks like I was standing on solid ground again. I drove home, put the folder back in its hiding place, and started boxing up the things in the garage that were unmistakably entirely his. Friday was 2 days away. Mark left for work that Friday morning, the way he always did. Coffee in the travel mug I'd bought him for Christmas 3 years ago, a kiss on my cheek, a comment about how he might be late because of some client thing. I knew by then that some client thing meant Ashley, and that whatever plans he'd made for that midnight text, Can't wait for Friday. Were about to collide with plans of my own that he knew nothing about. I had already met with the attorney twice more that week. The paperwork was drawn up and ready, not filed yet but close, pending one final conversation I intended to have on my own terms, in my own home, at a time of my choosing. I'd spoken to my sister finally the day before, and she'd driven up that morning to help me do what needed doing. We worked fast and quiet, his clothes folded, not thrown. I wasn't interested in theatrics, only in clarity. His golf clubs, the framed photo from his college roommate's wedding, the things that were unmistakably his and none of mine, packed into the same suitcases we used to take on family vacations, lined up neatly by the door like guests waiting to be shown out. At 10:14 that morning, my sister got a text from a number she didn't recognize. Richard's assistant, it turned out, reaching out on Mark's behalf because apparently he'd asked to borrow her phone in a hallway outside HR, his own having been temporarily held, per company policy, during the investigation. It simply said, "Is Claire home? Mark needs to talk to her." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to discuss over text. He came home at 1:40 in the afternoon, hours before I would have expected him on an ordinary Friday, his face the color of old paper. He walked in through the garage the way he always did and stopped dead when he saw the suitcases lined up by the door. "Claire," he said. "Claire, what is this?" "I think you already know," I said. I was sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd first opened that laptop 3 weeks earlier, with a cup of coffee in front of me, calm in a way that seemed to unsettle him more than any amount of shouting would have. "I got called into HR," he said, and I watched him try to decide, in real time, how much to admit and how much to still deny, the way people do when they're used to talking their way out of things. "They said someone reported expense violations. Claire, I swear, I don't know what—" "Ashley," I said, "you were supposed to see her tonight. Can't wait for Friday. She texted you 3 weeks ago. Except Friday isn't going quite the way either of you planned." I watched the color drain further from his face. "You went through my phone," he said, and there was something almost indignant in his voice, as if I were the one who'd broken something sacred between us. "I went through our life, Mark," I said. 3 years of it. 41 hotel charges, a jewelry store I've never set foot in, a company card you used to pay for a woman 12 years younger than me who apparently reports to you at work, which I understand your employer has some very strict feelings about." He sat down across from me, heavily, the way a man sits when his legs have stopped fully cooperating. "I lost my job," he said quietly. "They walked me out an hour ago." "I know," I said. "I was there Thursday. I showed Richard the statements myself." He stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time in years. Not the woman who packed his lunches and asked how his day was and smiled at his jokes even when they weren't funny, but someone else entirely. Someone who had apparently been sitting across from him this whole time, watching, calculating, waiting. "How could you do this to me?" he asked, and I felt something in me go very still again. The same stillness from that first midnight, except this time it wasn't shock, it was clarity. "I didn't do anything to you, Mark," I said. "I just stopped protecting you from what you did to yourself." I slid the folder across the table. A copy, the same one Richard had seen, along with the paperwork from my attorney, already drawn up, needing only my signature and, eventually, his. "The suitcases are packed," I said. "You can stay in a hotel tonight. I hear you're familiar with a few good ones." He tried a few more times, the way people do when they can feel a door closing and haven't yet accepted it. He said he could explain. He said it hadn't meant what I thought it meant. He said at one point, voice cracking in a way that might have broken my heart 4 months earlier, that he still loved me, that this didn't have to be the end. "It stopped being up to you a while ago, Mark," I said. "I think it stopped being up to you the day you activated a second phone plan and didn't tell me." He didn't have an answer for that. There wasn't one. He asked, quietly, if he could see Danny before he left town for the day, and I told him that was between him and his son, that I wasn't going to be the one standing in the way of that conversation, whatever shape it took. To his credit, he called Danny himself, right there in the driveway, and I heard just enough of it through the open door to know it wasn't an easy call for either of them. He didn't say anything else to me after that. There wasn't really anything left to say. I watched him carry his own bags out to a car that no longer smelled like a marriage, and I stood in the doorway of the house we'd raised our son in, and I didn't cry. Not then. That came later, quietly, alone, the way grief does when it finally has room to breathe. But even through the tears, underneath them, there was something else, something steady, something that felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, like the ground holding my weight again. It's been 4 months now. Mark found a new job eventually, something smaller, something that pays less and asks fewer questions about his last position's sudden ending. I hear about it secondhand, through Danny mostly, who has his own complicated feelings about all of it. Angry at his father, protective of me, caught in the particular grief of realizing your parents are just people, capable of the same failures as anyone else. Ashley, as it turns out, didn't stay in the picture much longer either. I don't know the details, and I've stopped needing to. Some stories aren't mine to finish, I only needed to finish my part of it. The divorce was finalized 8 weeks ago. I kept the house, I kept my business, which, in a strange twist I didn't see coming, actually grew that spring. Word travels in a small town, and more than one woman found her way to my office after hearing, in whatever quiet way these things travel, that I was the kind of person who noticed what didn't add up. One of them, a woman I'd never met before, sat across from my desk a few weeks ago and told me, almost apologetically, that a mutual friend had mentioned my name. She didn't say much more than that, and I didn't ask her to. I just handed her a legal pad and a pen, the same way I once sat alone at my own kitchen table, and told her that whatever she needed to figure out, numbers were a good place to start. She thanked me on her way out, in a voice that sounded like she hadn't been thanked in a while. I've thought a lot, these past few months, about the version of me that existed before that midnight text, the one who packed lunches and asked about work and let a quiet unease sit unexamined for years because examining it felt like more than she could carry. I don't think badly of her. She was doing the best she knew how to do with the information she had. But I don't recognize her quite the same way anymore either. Something in me changed permanently that night, and I've come to believe it wasn't a hardening so much as a waking up. I think about that midnight text sometimes, still. Miss you already. Can't wait for Friday. I think about the version of myself who read it, once, then again, and felt the world tilt sideways beneath her. And how, instead of falling, she found her footing in the one thing she'd always trusted more than promises. The numbers, the pattern, the truth, laid out plainly enough that no one, not even the person telling it, could pretend not to see it. Danny came home last weekend, just for the day, and we sat on the back porch the way we used to when he was small, before college, before any of this. He asked me, carefully, the way 22-year-olds ask questions they're not sure they want the answers to, whether I regretted it, any of it, the waiting, the folder, the coffee with Richard I never drank. I told him no. Not for a second. Because here's what I've learned at 51. Sitting on a porch I now own free and clear, in a life that is smaller in some ways and infinitely larger in others. Some people expect that when you find out the truth, you'll fall apart. They expect tears, shouting, a woman undone by grief, easy to predict, easy to manage, easy in the end to outlast. They don't expect the quiet ones, the ones who read the text once, set the phone back down exactly where they found it, and start, calmly, methodically, building a case. He never saw me coming. And by the time he did, it was already Friday.